Okay, I think it is time to start our presentation. So welcome everybody to the quarterly presentation on transport of dangerous goods and related questions, regulatory updates for the next or for the fall season. Just a little bit about what's going on here. My name is Barbara Foster, and I'm the regulatory expert, or one of the regulatory experts here at ICC. We're going to be talking about various topics. I just passed my 35th anniversary in August, so I've been working with not only transportation of hazardous materials or dangerous goods, but also the hazard communication regulations such as WHMIS and OSHA. So it's been a long, fun ride. For those of you that have joined, if you have a question, we have a fairly big group, and this is in a webinar format. So if you do have a question, there is a, you'll see in the buttons at the top in your control panel, there is a Q&A button. So you can click on that. Like that, click on that, select ask a question. That will appear at the bottom of the pane that pops up. You can type in your question, press send, don't forget to do that. And our monitors, Pam and Kelly here, will, if there's something that can be easily answered, they can do it. Otherwise, if it's a more regulatory issue, they will leave it, and I will get back to all those questions at the end of the presentation. One question that a lot of people do ask is, are we recording? And yes, we are, and you will be provided with a link to the recording after the conclusion. So yes, you will be able to access the presentation again as a recording, and if you want to review it or share it with anyone, please feel free. A little bit about ICC. Our company has been dealing with transportation of hazardous materials or dangerous goods for over 35 years. So as you can tell, I didn't come right in on the ground floor, but very close. Dealing with supplies and services for people who are involved in either the transport of hazmat business or related hazard communication. So we've got things like labels, placards, a whole bunch of things, packaging for dangerous goods in transport, training aids, also our training and consulting. So please check out our website, www.thecompliancecenter.com, and take a look. Lots of what we have are stocking items, and if we don't have it as a stocking item, we can probably either make it or source it for you if it's related to transport of hazmat, dangerous goods, or labels for workplace or consumer hazard communication. So there's just some information about us. One thing that we do invite our customers to consider is we do have a regulatory helpline. During business hours, you can contact us, and one of our regulatory people will try and see if we can find you an answer for any of your questions. Our agenda for the day is we are going to start with looking at the U.S. Situation with the Department of Transportation and the Pipelines and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration updates, then switch to the equivalent for Canada, for Transport Canada and the Canadian Transportation of Dangerous Goods regulations. Take a look at what's going on currently in the international scene, and ending up with hazard communication. In the US, that is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and in Canada, that is Health Canada and the WHMIS regulations. So that's the areas we'll be talking about today. And as always, when I got started to put together this presentation, I thought, gee, it's the middle of the summer, early fall, not an awful lot exciting is happening. And of course, by the end of it, I'm like, how am I going to stuff all of this into one-hour session. So starting with the Department of Transport, the DOT, PHMSA, and Title 49 of the Code of Federal Regulations. One thing that's been on the go for a while is a rule dealing with transport of liquefied natural gas in railway tankers. This is both a flammable and a cryogenic liquid, and there are some safety concerns. So they've been going back and forth between having a rule that would allow you to use things like DOT 113 tank cars, and then going, no, maybe that's not a good idea. So they finally come out with a final rule. You can see the link there if you want to go look it up directly. So that will amend the hazardous materials regulations to suspend the authorization for being allowed to ship liquefied natural gas in railway tank cars while awaiting further safety studies. This is going to be effective October 31st, and it's not putting a total end to the question, but is saying, particularly after some of the incidents involving railway tank cars over the past year or so, that we do need additional studies to make sure that this is safe. Another one, interesting one regarding the railways, HM 263. Now this is just a notice of proposed rulemaking. It's not a final rule, but again, barring a lot of objections from the stakeholders, this is probably generally what the shape of it is going to be. It's a response to safety concerns about railway derailments and other accidents, such as the infamous East Palestine derailment earlier this year. The goal would be that to make it easier for local emergency responders in such an incident to know what's going on, what hazardous chemicals are being carried, what tankers are carrying these chemicals, and that this would be electronically pushed from the railways to the responders. Again, nowadays with our increased electronic communication, this doesn't sound like this should be terribly complicated to set up, but it's different than it has been in the past. So the goal would be that the railways can push what they call their consists, documents which describe, again, what the chemicals are, where they are on the train, and so forth, to the emergency responders, and they would have this before they arrive at the scene of the accident. Comments on this have just closed, August 25th. If you want to take a look at it, you can go to this link. It's called the FAST Act Requirements for Real-Time Train Consist Information. Real-time meaning basically as soon as physically possible, that when the responders show up, that the railway would have provided them details about the chemicals, the train, and recommended emergency response. PHMSA is also looking for a lot of feedback from stakeholders on various initiatives. For example, there's an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. Now this means that they haven't really even put together a rule. This is more for information gathering, giving stakeholders a chance to sort of get in on the ground floor, saying on these various topics what they think would be good ideas, what they do and do not want to see. This is open for anybody who would like to make a comment to the DOT until October 3rd, 2023. Again, there will be the link that is being put up, so if you need to access that. And again, if you have something that you'd like to have a say in how the regulations are formed, it's a very good idea to put your 2 cents in here. This covers a lot. There's a really long list of topics, that they're looking for. And obviously they would not all come out in one single rule. There are probably multiple rules that would result from this, but it gives you an idea of what DOT is thinking about. Get our slide to move forward. Okay, so we've got, for example, evaluation of whether carrier maintenance of emergency response information is maintained or is required, or for example, there's other ways that carriers could keep handy emergency response, such as being provided with emergency response guidebooks. So again, this is sort of a paperwork reduction concept. Then do we need extensions of the retesting period for various specification packagings? ICC creates a lot of specification packagings, and it does keep our staff busy. Once you've got the approval for a package design, then you have to have it retested periodically. So again, maybe we could expand it, or maybe stakeholders feel, yeah, having a regular testing requirement is, you know, in a relatively short period of time is still a good safety precaution. One that anybody who deals with aerosols will be interested in is looking at steps to harmonize the U.S. classification of aerosols for transportation, getting it more in line with the rest of the world. Right now, the U.S. does have a different definition of aerosols. Now, most aerosols will be the same, for example, US, Canada, Europe, and so forth, but there are some differences which lead to certain products really being a headache, trying to get them classified for the US versus the international market. So what steps, if any, should the DOT take? Should we simply adopt everything from the UN recommendations, or are there some safety requirements that we want to stand by? Should there be relief provided for the transport of IBCs, intermediate bulk containers, that contain flammable residues? It's long been a concern that if there's a vapor from a flammable residue in a packaging, that can actually make the packaging more dangerous than if it was full of the flammable liquid. But there has been some testing that says maybe this isn't true, particularly with things like IBCs. So they've been doing some studies. They want people who ship flammable residues in IBCs to give them some feedback, what they think is necessary for safety. Some revisions of requirements for shipping damaged, defective, or recalled lithium batteries. Of course, these are the ones which are most likely to catch on fire. So do we need to increase protection, reduce requirements? Again, anybody say in the battery recycling area might want to have some words about that. One that's very interesting to ICC, training exception for limited quantities. In Canada, if you ship a limited quantity, you are not required to have dangerous goods training certification. In the United States, there is no exemption from limited quantities from the general training requirement. So the DOT wants to, do American stakeholders think that official hazmat training should be required for limited quantities. Also with limited quantities, adjusting provisions for the shipping documents for limited quantities by vessel. By ground, limited quantities do not require shipping documents. By vessel, they do. So should this be harmonized? If so, how could it be harmonized? Particularly because there's a distinction between 49 CFR and the international rules such as the IMDG code. Procedures for sampling and testing programs for unrefined petroleum-based products. So if you're in the oil industry, how much testing do you have to do for samples or products taken from an oil well before shipping it? Because not all oil in a well is going to have the same level of flammability. So how much sampling do you have to do to verify what you're shipping has a certain level of flammability? They want to look at revisions to the oil spill response plan requirements for anybody who's shipping oily materials. This is not normally thought of as part of the hazmat regulations, but it is very close in 49 CFR, section 170 or 130.31. Alternate ways of communicating the EX numbers for class 1. DOT is moving away from having it marked on the package, but should they still say be communicated by shipping documents? There are certain exceptions in 49 CFR for ethyl alcohol, but only right now if they're retail products. So should they extend this to all ethyl alcohol solutions, if they meet certain criteria, does it really matter whether they're retail or non-retail? In fact, if they're being shipped industrially, maybe they're even safer than retail shipments. Another one, if you deal with Division 4.3, dangerous when wet, in Packing Group 1, the highly reactive materials, these can currently not go under the small quantity provisions, section 173.4, which is a nice way of shipping really, really small amounts of product. They're thinking maybe this complete restriction is a little too much. Maybe they can allow it to be used in some cases for 4.3s in Packing Group 1. If you're in the automotive industry, they're looking at how to ship safety devices such as airbags or seatbelt pretensioners for recycling. How can we improve that system? And going back, looking at some basic definitions. In the text, they use the term basic description and shipping description, but they never really define what those are. So they're just thinking, should there be an official definition, say that a shipping name is the shipping name, or a shipping description is the shipping name, hazard class, identification number, and packing group. So what exactly is meant by that? And what is the difference between a basic description and the shipping description? Discussing removing the 60-day renewal requirement for approvals and special permits, and reviewing the current special U.S. procedures for shipping oxidizing gas by aircraft. This goes back to the ValueJet crash back in 1996, caused by oxygen generators. And because of that, the DOT put in some special rules for shipping those items, as well as cylinders of oxidizing gases requiring special packaging that's not used in the rest of the world. So again, was this an overreaction? Is it still necessary for safety? Or does the evidence say that maybe they can go back to doing it basically as everyone else does? Should the Convention for Safe Containers data plate be required for domestic only shipment by vessel? This is an international standard for large means of containment where there's a special data plate that says it's safe for vessel shipment, but that's an international requirement? Should it be required for domestic only water shipment? Providing a unique identifier for freight containers in rail transport, should that be an issue? Various other topics on rail, fairly technical ones. Updating requirements for passenger carrying motor vehicles. This is something that is actually becoming more significant, where we get into things like Uber drivers who may go into doing small package delivery, and maybe, can they carry hazmat while they're doing this? Then a number of topics, again, fairly specialized on cargo tanks and their standards. A review of the ways to display placards on IBCs. There's various options now in the regulations. Should they be expanded? Should they be cut down so they're simpler? And the last one in the list of topics was emerging technologies for hazmat transport, particularly those that are related to climate change. So new technologies that can improve the system, DOT wants to hear about them. You've got a better mousetrap, so to speak, let them know, and they can see maybe the regulations can be adjusted to incorporate those. So if you see any topics there that are interesting, you can talk to DOT and let them know what your feelings are about it. Then they can use that to move on to more rulemaking. Another hazard collection notice that has come out, comments are open until September 28th, is this one, docket PHMSA 2023-0007. This is primarily about paperwork, looking at areas where companies have to save or maintain paperwork and to see what can be reduced or simplified, particularly regarding the reports on package testing. So do you need to have a whole library of paperwork saved in case the DOT wants to look at it, or can they reduce it, simplify it, and make it easier? So again, if you see anything there, let the DOT know about it so they can work it into their rulemaking in advance. And if you are going to make comments about any of these things, if you can let them know numbers about estimated costs, both cost benefit, cost to operations, DOT loves that. They would be very happy to know exactly how much a change would cost versus benefit companies. Leaving the DOT for a moment, the Environmental Protection Agency has put forward a notice on transport or used drum management and reconditioning. So if you are in the area where you either are a drum reconditioner or you send drums out for reconditioning, you may want to take a look at this. Again, it's a very preliminary exploration of issues, how the regulations can be improved to get the best safety bang for your buck, although that may sound a little ominous when talking about hazmat. But it's a response to a report that came out prior to COVID on what they call the Drum Reconditioner Damage Report. So again, what's the safest way that drums can be handled, that they can eliminate the risk of release, both in storage and in transportation. So that's the DOT. Let's take a look here now at Canada. First thing, Canada, a couple months ago, we had a cabinet reshuffle. This smiling gentleman is now the Minister of Transport at Transport Canada, the Honourable Pedro Rodriguez. So he's the one that gets the blame and the brickbats. But this wasn't because of a new election or anything. It would not be expected there be any major shift in Transport Canada's focus. It's just pretty much going to be staying the course as far as I can see. One thing that came out recently, and a little bit unusual, something called the Miscellaneous Amendment. Usually in Canada, as the US has the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, and then when that is reviewed by stakeholders, then we eventually get the final rule. In Canada, we get a proposed change put in Canada Gazette 1, and then the final rule would be what they call Canada Gazette 2. But sometimes they do skip Canada Gazette 1. There's one case with what they call the Miscellaneous Amendment, came out June 23rd and was official as of that date because it really wasn't changing very much significant. It is mostly, the goal is simply to repeal anything that's obsolete, check where there's differences between English and French. One issue in Canada is that the regulation has to be published in both English and French, and occasionally downstream someone will notice that they are saying different things. So they want to make sure that the English and French are saying exactly the same thing. also want to harmonize, should be a bullet here, harmonize some terms used in the dangerous goods regulations, harmonize terms that may be a little bit out of date, harmonize them with what's in the Transportation of Dangerous Goods Act, the official legislation that brought in TDG, or in related regulations. For example, TDG had been talking about contacts at Transport Canada going to the Director General of Dangerous Goods, whereas the Act just says, you know, correspondence goes to the Minister. And of course, it is not Mr. Rodriguez himself. It's going to be the staff at the Dangerous Goods Directorate. But for harmonization, they've, wherever it said Dangerous Goods or Director General, they've replaced it with the Minister. And they've noticed that there were a few provisions where they're getting a lot of questions. People couldn't quite understand what they were trying to say. So just clarification to make it clear what a particular section meant. Also looking for typographical, grammatical, spelling, numbering, and punctuation errors, which always do crop up. So again, no real change in the intent of most of the regulations, just, you know, some proofreading and clarification. One thing is update references to documents incorporate by reference. So if they noticed that they were referring to an out-of-date document, some other standard or something that had been updated, they would include an update to the most recent version. Three things I found that really could qualify as action items, most significant changes. There's something called the 500 kilogram exemption that is a little bit like the materials of trade exemption in the US, very vaguely. They're certainly not word for word or anything, but kind of aimed at easing the situation of people who have a few dangerous goods on their vehicle, particularly if they're not for delivery, they're just stuff they're going to use en route. So this would allow you, among other things, not to have to put dangerous goods labels on if packages already had other warning labels on. And one thing that they had left out was labels under the Consumer Chemicals and Containers Regulations, the consumer labeling system versus the workplace labeling system of WHMIS. So the amendment brought in you can have packages labeled under the CCCR. So if I go to a paint store, get a can of paint that has a CCCR label on it, I can put it in my truck or my car and carry it without having to put dangerous goods labels on it. And that was just something that had fallen out because of various regulatory changes, and it's good to see it back. If you're using the shipping name fumigated unit, the UN has changed that to fumigated cargo transport unit, which the amendment has put into place. And if you're shipping UN 2264, the previous name in the regs was dimethylcyclohexamine, and it's now going to be NN dimethylcyclohexamine, again to match the UN. Something that Transport Canada has been working on that created a great deal of uproar when it was first proposed, but has turned out to be relatively, I would say, small potatoes, is the CID, or Client Identification Database, the Transport Canada wanted to create. This was, they say the goal is to create an accurate and reliable inventory of regulated parties and sites where dangerous goods are imported, offered for transport, handled, or transported in Canada. Actually, when I first started decades ago, there was a paper requirement for something like this, which Transport Canada eventually apparently thought was too much work and deleted. But they're going back to the idea that if you ship or carry dangerous goods in Canada, you have to basically sign on to this database and let them know some basic details. Now, when it was first proposed, I think a lot of people misunderstood what Transport Canada was trying to say. And there were some people who assumed that they're looking for some sort of real-time tracking of dangerous goods all across Canada. So if you're shipping, one 45-gallon drum of acetone from Toronto to Montreal, that would be in the system. And Transport Canada had to come back and say, no, we had nothing that ambitious. It's something a little bit more like the like the registration requirement in DOT, although they have not yet mentioned anything about having user fees or a fee for doing the registration. I'm not going to say that might not come later, but for the time being, they just want people to sign up. Transport Canada has invited stakeholders to take part in a trial run that started in August. Again, they have cut back the information to the bare bones, I think. So if you ship products that are not exempted, for example, they're not limited quantities under TDG Section 117, or lithium batteries under Special Provision 34, exempted. Basically, if you're not going under an exemption, you're shipping fully regulated dangerous goods, or you're carrying them, they will expect you to go to their little website and tell them who you are. So here's what they're looking for. And again, it is not anything really earth-shattering. They say they want your CRA business number. They mention it's optional if you have one. Company's legal name and operating name, primary business address, a person who will be the contact with a telephone number and email, and then an alternate, because we know, there's always people moving around, changing jobs, leaving and coming, so they want to have at least two people that they can contact. Addresses of the sites that the company is operating, what modes of transport are being used, ground, air, ocean, and so forth. Types of activities, handling, offering for transport, importing, or transporting, and the classes and divisions that the company deals with. Notice that they are not looking here for quantities. They aren't even looking for UN numbers or shipping names, just, if you're Acme Chemicals, are you shipping flammable liquids? Are you shipping 6.1 toxics? Are you shipping class 8 corrosives? And so forth. And this would all be done online. So the large number of person hours that had a lot of companies were estimating, I think really comes down to this is going to be, a couple of hours once a year where somebody logs in, checks that all the current information is updated, and that's all you have to do. There's no requirement that anybody has to spend a full, one or more person full time trying to track all the dangerous goods that you ship. One thing that Transport Canada is looking at is updating the penalties. The penalties are put into the TDG Act at first, back in 1980. Again, boggles my mind, but that's over 40 years ago. And what could be considered a fairly sizable fine then, thanks to inflation, is nowhere near as impressive. So they are, first of all, I mentioned in the last presentation, with the Act, they're looking at amending the Act in Parliament to increase the maximum fines there. But also for minor violations, the current system in TDG is that inspectors can go to something called the Contraventions Regulations under the Contraventions Act, and there are ticketing offenses. So they have put forward a proposal to increase the fines there as well. Again, it is a proposal. It is not a finalized amendment. They're looking for comments by September 8th. So that gives you 24 whole hours if you have anything you'd like to tell them. Here is a list of what some of the current versus proposed fines would be. For example, failing to use required or permitted means of containment. So there's something wrong with your packaging. Not that it's caused any major catastrophic accident, but it's just they notice, hey, you're supposed to say you're using a UN approved package, and it was not one that was authorized to be used for that type of dangerous goods. Maximum fine per violation right now, or standard fine is $500. They're proposing to move it up to $2,000. So I notice in general, it seems like taking the current fines and multiplying them by 4. So instead of going from maybe $500 to $1,000, looking now more at going from $2,000 to $4,000 for ticketing offenses. So it'll be more expensive if you don't follow the rules, but not a huge jump. Speaking of packaging, in Canada, a lot of the packaging rules are not actually in TDG. They are in reference standards, and a lot of them come from this group called the Canadian General Standards Board. The advantage of that is the board can update a standard, and Transport Canada doesn't have to update the regulations because it's just referencing the standard. We've got some new standards published for 2023. We've got CGSB 43.147, which is talking about containers for transport of dangerous goods by rail, and 149, which is for a special type of container called a ton container. Now, the 2023 version has not yet been incorporated by reference. So until they actually get a reference to the 2023 version, we use the old one, but it's a much easier change for them to just update in something like the miscellaneous amendment to say change to that particular year. But sometimes they take a long time. For example, for non-bulk packaging, there is a standard. It's not from the CGSB currently, but it's managed by Transport Canada. It's called TP 14850. The version referenced in TDG is from 2010. There was actually a 2018 update, but it never got incorporated by amendment, and it probably never will, because they're planning on turning it back to the CGSB. Will be then incorporated into CGSB 43.150. But our packaging person is in the committee working on this, and he says that they've decided that they want more consultation. They want to go back to the stakeholders. So TP 14850 is going to be with us for a while longer. They have not yet decided on coming up with a final version for the non-bulk packaging standard run by the CGSB. Explosives, they are working on an update. Consultation ended August 18th, but they haven't issued their final report yet. The goal here is basically to align with the 22nd edition of the UN recommendations, with update references to any other dangerous goods packaging standards, certain special packaging standards modified, again in reference to the 22nd edition of the UN. We've got additional requirements referring to the reuse of packaging and partially filled packaging, updated decontamination requirements, added provisions to prohibit the use of lightweight IBCs for shipping explosives. So again, if you're in the explosives business in Canada, this is not final yet, but it's definitely something to keep your eye open, because hopefully when they do get it finalized, then they update the reference in Transport Canada and TDG, and we would then be using the new standard, which if you ship internationally, you always want it to be as up to date with the UN as possible. They also did a review of the CGSB standard for reconditioning drums for dangerous goods. Consultation ended August 21st, and basically they didn't plan any significant changes. Their little blurb on it says, this new edition is simply a reaffirmation of the version from 2019. So basically saying, yep, we're still going to be using that. Transport Canada is moving cautiously forward on something that I find kind of interesting, a little bit quirky. Remotely piloted aircraft or drones for delivery of dangerous goods. They are currently studying this. They've got a considerable amount of interest, but they say we're not going to rush into this. This is new territory. So they're going to use a phased approach where the first phase will limit amending the regulations possibly to allow remotely piloted aircraft to deliver certain low-risk dangerous goods such as lithium batteries or dry ice. So yes, maybe you have an area where you need to get lithium batteries into. It's not convenient to drive them. You could just fire up the drone and send them over. They're already allowing certain groups to do this. Certain operators have got permits that allow them to do something that's not in the regulations, but they're starting small, letting these companies develop systems for making deliveries of hazmat using the drones and seeing what the safety data they get from it. So currently they are gathering information on the cost benefit by public consultation. So if you go to Transport Canada's website, they do have a page on if you want to make comments on remotely piloted aircraft. Again, nothing ready to go as far as a regulation, but it is an area that they're looking at working on. Now, in previous sessions that I've done, I've mentioned two big amendments. One is the competency-based training amendment that will require training for shipping dangerous goods to comply with the CGSB standard for this type of training. Again, the CGSB can create a standard and it's just kind of a good idea until Transport Canada says you must follow it. They'd come out with a Gazette 1 version, but I've heard that there have been a number of significant concerns brought up by various stakeholders. For example, the shipping industry felt that it was too focused on ground and air without much about training regarding water shipment. So it looks like, suggested at least, that they will go back to the drawing board, revise the proposed amendment, and they'll be out as a new Gazette 1 proposal. And they say probably, and again, this is not carved in stone, they can change it anytime they want, but what they're looking at is the new Canada Gazette for public consultation would be out in late 2024. So that's going to be not even this year, going to be next year, probably a year from now. And if that goes well, then Canada Gazette 2 would be out sometime in 2025, and then there would be a 1-year transition period, which would mean that it would start to become mandatory probably sometime in 2026. So if you're just chomping at the bit to start revising your training programs, hold off a bit because they apparently felt that there were some things that they had to reconsider. The International Harmonization Amendment. This was one that I kind of hoped that they would get out. Again, it's for us in regulatory, the more national regulations are harmonized with international regulations, the better. It makes our lives much easier. So this has already come out in a Canada Gazette 1 version, but apparently we will not see the Canada Gazette 2 again until late mid-2024. So again, I'm not sure the difference between late mid and mid late, but probably sometime in the second half of 2024, we will see the International Harmonization Amendment. Now, the next one, take a look at is international regulations and developments there. Usually this is, summer is usually a pretty slow period, and it's not even likely to be too exciting for the upcoming year because the international regulations based on the UN go on a 2-year biennium, 2-year cycle, and it's odd to even year. So we've made the biggest changes starting 2023, 2024, not going to be terribly exciting. If you ship by air, of course, you will need a new IATA book, which there is a new book due out. If you're waiting for a hard copy, it should be out probably within the next couple of months. If you go with the electronic copy, you can get it now, which, if you, I do recommend the electronic IATA book. It is fairly easy to learn to use, and I found it very convenient. IATA, of course, the regulations under IATA are based on the ICAO technical instructions, and that is the UN book, and it is 2023 to 2024. So if you have the version from 2023, nothing's going to change until the start of 2025. The IMDG code goes on kind of a wonky cycle. There's an older version called Amendment 40 that may still be used this year, but you have to stop using it January 1st next year. You must then use the Amendment 41. Now you can use Amendment 41 now, but again, it becomes mandatory that you gotta leave the old one behind to go with the new one by the end of 2020. Amendment 41 should be mandatory starting January 1st, January 24. Since I did get the IATA book in electronic form, I was able to check their list of changes. So again, since ICAO isn't really doing much of anything, there isn't anything really exciting here. As always, some state and operator variations will be changing for 2024. They put in a rule that non-refillable cylinders containing a flammable gas will be limited to a water capacity not exceeding 1.25 liters. Packing instruction 954. Now that is the instruction for shipping dry ice by air. Just a clarification that if dry ice is placed in an overpack, now dry ice has always said that the net quantity of dry ice per package must be marked on each package. They just want to clarify that when you put, say, several packages of dry ice in one outer package, the overpack, the total net quantity of dry ice in the overpack must be marked on the overpack. The airlines are very concerned about knowing how much dry ice they're loading because this affects the ventilation requirements. So they want to make sure that overpacks, they can look at them and tell how much dry ice is in there. The packing instruction 952, which is for battery-powered vehicles or equipment, originally had been written for battery-powered vehicles. And then people said, well, what about certain equipment that it's not really a vehicle, but it's large? So they squeezed equipment in there, but apparently they hadn't really gone through the whole thing and made sure that where it said, here's what you do for vehicles, to add or equipment. So they've added or equipment wherever they feel it's appropriate. They've given some clarifications for UN specification markings. A clarification that the shipper's declaration number, that on a shipper's declaration, the number and type of inner packages is not required. Now, if you've filled out a shipper's declaration, let's say you're shipping one fiberboard box containing 4 1-liter bottles. The way you're supposed to write that up is 1 fiberboard box times 4 liters. Sometimes though, you'll have people that try and get more detailed. They'll say 1 fiberboard box containing 4 times 1 liter bottles, and that creates confusion. So they've tried to clarify, nope, that's not what they want. They just want to know the outer package description and the amount per package. They don't need to know about the inners. So that's not a change, it's just a clarification. So not an awful lot happening for 2024, but if you want to get prepared for 2025, they mentioned that we have Appendix H added for this upcoming year, and that will have the intended changes for 2025. So when you get the 2024 book, you can see what's going to happen the year after that. One thing that I've noticed is the UN has created entries now for sodium batteries. Now, this is apparently a technology that is similar to lithium batteries. I haven't done a lot of research on it, but I presume that sodium would be a more accessible material. Lithium is relatively rare. There may even be some safety improvements as well, but this will be the first time that sodium batteries, as opposed to lithium batteries, will be listed as a shipping name. And then we get to hazard communication. Again, in the United States, we have OSHA. In Canada, under Health Canada, we have the WHMIS for workplace, and we also have the Consumer Chemicals and Containers Regulations for consumer products. And I've mentioned this several of our presentations, that Health Canada has brought in an amendment to update WHMIS requirements under the hazardous products regulations to revision 7 of the UN classification and labeling of hazardous chemicals regulation or guide, the Purple Book, giving us a fairly long transition period, mandatory compliance with the new rules December 15th, 2025. Now, this was supposed to be done in lockstep with the US OSHA. Like this little furry fellow, we're stuck, waiting patiently for something to happen. So OSHA said, yes, we're working on it. We're working on our final rule to update to revision 7. Should be out anytime, sometime this year. Last I heard from Health Canada, someone asked them about that, and they said we have no information from OSHA when to expect that to be done. So hopefully it will be soon. Otherwise, we will run into a problem where, again, our labels, classification, and safety data sheets will start to get disharmonized. I mentioned this in the last presentation, but, well, what would happen? So Canada says you use the updated GHS. US says, nope, we're sticking with the old GHS for the time being. Well, during that time period, up until the time that we must comply in Canada, we could just keep with the old system for both countries and hope that OSHA moves along sometime before 2025. Or we could move ahead in Canada, use the current hazardous product system, but keep the old labels and SDSs for any product that we are sending to the United States, or if you're an American supplier, for what you're doing in the United States, and then have to use the new stuff for Canada. What I don't recommend, but some companies are thinking maybe it'd be simpler, it's seen that that OSHA does intend to update. Assume that everybody is going with revision 7 sooner rather than later. Make the changes in both countries, and hopefully that's only going to be a problem for a few months. Keep in mind, though, that it's not yet really acceptable in the United States to use the new classification system, such as for aerosols. Safety data sheets, there's really only one minor change to the format. there shouldn't be a big issue there if you go with the new system. But with the classification and labeling, there may be some issues. So hopefully harmonization will come sooner rather than later. We'll keep you updated if we hear anything. Now, something that's kind of interesting on the Canadian side with consumer products. A couple of issues going on at Health Canada. One is Canada had a online outreach program that I took part in a month or so ago regarding a number of issues with WHMIS. One of the big topics was WHMIS says that if you have a product that is labeled and intended for sale through the retail market, it doesn't get WHMIS labels on it. It has labels under the Consumer Chemicals and Containers Regulations. For example, all aerosols get this funny little exploding bomb symbol, and there's mandatory wording, which is different from the GHS wording. Now, WHMIS, to avoid sort of double regulating something, WHMIS currently says that if the product is labeled as a consumer product but is brought into the workplace, just as you might bring it into the home, you don't need to have it relabeled under WHMIS, and you don't need to have a safety data sheet. But that has always been a little bit of a sticking point, and apparently there has been a fatality that some people suggested was due to not having WHMIS labels on a consumer type product. I don't know the details about it, but that's kind of what I heard. So Health Canada said maybe we should revise or eliminate that exemption. I got the feeling that what they're currently looking at is probably keeping with the consumer labeling for the time being. It would make life easier if we all went with GHS, but that might be a big shock to the Canadian consumers going with a whole new system. But I think they're really looking at getting safety data sheets for products like this in the workplace. And they were looking for stakeholders, companies who are selling or distributing consumer products in Canada for various methods that they could see this could be done, what the cost would be. For example, one suggestion was you could put like a QR code on your consumer products, and then any workplace that wanted to get a safety data sheet could just scan that and download the SDS directly there. So right now they're looking for input from the stakeholders. So, you know, if this affects you, this is a time to let Health Canada know what your feelings are. The other thing they're looking at, going back to the consumer regulations don't cover the full range of things that the GHS does. It's looking primarily at flammability, irritants and corrosives, acute poisons, aspiration hazards, and superglues, the cyanoacrylate glues. They haven't looked a lot at long-term health effects. So you could say that the consumer products are getting much less warnings than a workplace chemical would be. And is that really a good idea? They're looking at, should the CCCR also include classifications and warnings for carcinogenicity, germ cell mutagenicity, reproductive toxicity, specific organ toxicity, respiratory or skin sensitization. Again, these are all the long-term effects you'll see in WHMIS based on the globally harmonized system. So there's a little notice of intent to work on proposed new regulations. Again, you can check that online if you are in the consumer product business in Canada. Just to finish up, always keep in mind that ICC is here to help. If you go to our website and you click on our Help Center, you can sign up for our free newsletter. Again, it's free, just to let you know if anything new is, any news about dangerous goods or workplace chemical regulations. We also have our blogs. We've got a lot of interesting topics about various new regulations or safety issues. Now, that leaves us with our questions. So let's take a look and see with any questions. Okay, so I've got a question that says, slide 14, I missed what you said about EX numbers. Yeah, EX numbers are for explosives. And one of the things they were looking at that they had listed was alternate ways of communicating EX numbers for Class 1. Rather than marking them on each package, could they be communicated, say, by shipping papers? David Cox says, I thought the DOT identified the shipping description. Possibly it does. I didn't check to see what they actually had there, but again, that was one of the topics that they said, looking at how to adequately define basic description, shipping description. Possibly they feel that, you know, they're being used interchangeably when they really shouldn't be, or maybe we only need one of them. CID, clarification on agricultural shipments that are dangerous goods. This is not clear in their write-up. Any further information? No, I haven't seen anything else regarding agricultural chemicals. If they are under the exemptions, though, there's quite, it would sound to me that the way they've explained it sort of is, oh, well, if it's exempted, you don't have to register. But I know that some of the agricultural exemptions are for fairly large amounts of product. So that may have to be clarified. Again, right now they're just sort of testing to see whether the website will work and that you can input data without the whole thing crashing. So yeah, they do need to clarify, is it all the exemptions given in Part 1, or is it just some of them? They've mentioned limited quantities specifically, but they haven't mentioned all the others. So that's one that I'll keep an eye out for, and if there's any further information, we will try and pass it on. David Cox, another question. When will Transport Canada update lithium battery marks without a telephone number? I am hoping that will be when we've got our harmonization amendment. That's one of the things that I commented on the harmonization amendment. I said, for heaven's sakes, you know, this is, you want that to be in line with the international standards. IATA and ICAO, IMDG code are already saying you don't need the telephone number, and at a certain point you may not put the telephone number on there, or they'll refuse the shipment. So either Transport Canada has to change the regulations, or they will have to make sort of a policy statement that says, oh, by the way, until we get the regulations amended, we will not enforce this. That's one way they could go about it, but it's not the best way, obviously. There is a little bit of wiggle room. At the start of Part 4 safety marks, they say that you may use safety marks as shown in the appendix to Part 4 or in the UN recommendations. And you might say, well, if you've got a safety mark as shown in the UN without the telephone number on it, you might argue that that is authorized under that provision. But it would certainly be a really good idea. I don't understand what happened with the harmonization amendment. They must have got a ton of comments on it because it looked fairly straightforward to me. But again, that was something that I put in with my comments, that they really needed to address the lithium battery handling mark. So I don't know exactly when, but it's certainly something we will be looking at. Has there been any further discussion of the allowability of electronic documentation for carriers rather than the required hard copy? I think they are still just looking at the data that they got from their pilot program. It is still on their website, you know, as a heading. I haven't seen anything new on it for a while. But I think it is something that they would like to move forward. But I would kind of assume that, you know, they want to get competency-based training dealt with one way or another. And they're going to have to get the harmonization amendment dealt with, because otherwise, you know, it's going to be very difficult with shipments between Canada and the rest of the world. So I would say probably you might even see them maybe behind the scenes. They're working on a Gazette one already, but I can't say when they would do that. Again, talk to Transport Canada. They are never very clear on when they're going to do things. Miscellaneous amendments say dangerous goods safety mark is replaced with dangerous goods mark. Would be incorrect to refer them as safety marks. As long as everybody understands what you're talking about, certainly, yeah, the only time will be wrong, say, is if you were, say, trying to write something official. So if you're talking to Transport Canada inspector or sending a letter to Transport Canada, I would recommend that you use their terminology. Certainly in your training or everyday conversation, I mean, I'm still every now and then I refer to material safety data sheets rather than just safety data sheets. So I don't think it's wrong unless you're trying to say anything official, in which case it's got to use their terminology. David Cox, will Transport Canada recognize CHMM, CDGP, or DGSA professional credentials? There's nothing I've seen that they would say if you have, say, your dangerous goods safety advisory certification for Europe, that they're going to recognize that as being equivalent to dangerous goods training here in Canada. It's again, yeah, you could get DGSA and it doesn't reference transport specifically. The transport of dangerous goods certification is meant to say your employer is certifying you know what you need to do the job they assigned you. So in some bits, it's kind of like a little bit of liability protection for the worker, that their employer is certifying that, yes, we have told you what you need to know. You know, DGSA or CHMM or something will indicate that you're well trained and you know a lot about dangerous goods or hazmat or whatever, but it won't necessarily mean that you know about your particular company's operations. So I wouldn't expect there would be any direct correlation, at least anytime soon. Although I'm sure Transport Canada would say, hey, if we're talking to somebody with any of those designations, we'll assume that we know we're talking to somebody who knows what's what, that they understand regulations, and you know, we can talk to them sort of as professional to professional. One thing I have heard is that Transport Canada is looking in future maybe changing our current certification system to be more like the United States, where the company just trains you, gets your testing or evaluation, puts that on file, and the worker does not have to carry a specific card saying that they're dangerous goods trained. All the documentation will be kept by the employer. So that is one thing that might change in future, but I haven't heard anything about those professional designations giving you sort of like a skip over part of the training. Anyone have any other questions, or have I addressed all of them?
Looks like you answered all the questions, Barb.
Okay, great. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming here. Sorry we kind of went over an hour, but we had a lot of stuff to cover. I was really surprised how much came up at the last minute. Again, if ICC can help you anytime in future, please let us know. And you will be getting a link to the recording of the presentation sent out afterwards. So thank you. Have a good day. Have a good weekend coming up, and stay cool in this heat. Bye now.